All right, we have a new set of notes for you to take. This is going in your lecture notebook behind the CK12 readings for Unit 3. So you should have 3.1 to 3.5 currently there taped in. And so this handout and these notes can go immediately behind that. Don't forget to add this title, Notes Seed Plants, to the very first page of the unit so it's ready for a stamp as well. Okay, you do need a stamp for this. You should have picked up or gotten a handout from me, and so you can fill that out as you go. I've tried to leave space for things to write, so you should have enough room. You also, however, want to make sure that you have audio on as usual. There are some things that are not on the slide, but I'm going to be saying as explanations and things like that, so make sure that you add what you need. So when you go back to these notes later, you understand, you remember what they're about. Okay, so let's start by doing a little bit of a recall. Last unit, we focused mostly on this half of the evolutionary tree of plants. Okay, so ferns and the relatives and bryophytes like mosses. However, today we're focusing on this half right here. And the main difference is that after the development of vascular tissue, the next major evolutionary development was this ability to make seeds. And once this happened, and this ability to make seeds, that made a huge difference in terms of the success of plants being able to grow in a much bigger variety of environments. Okay, now you can see that there are two branches, cone-bearing plants and flowering plants, and so we're going to be focusing on each of these two branches today. Okay, so these seed-bearing plants, this second half of the evolutionary tree, actually counts for the majority of plants that are found on the planet. This is the most dominant group of plants, and there are actually two smaller groups found within this seed-bearing branch, and you saw it even on the previous slide. The first kind of branch are gymnosperms. So these are plants that bear seeds directly on the surface of cones. We'll talk about what cones are. And you have angiosperms, also known as flowering plants, and they make their seeds within a layer of tissue that acts as protection. Okay, so we'll kind of use this as our guide. We're going to talk about each of these individually, but first let's just talk a little bit generally speaking about seed-bearing plants. Okay, so one of the main things that make seed-bearing plants so successful is, unlike bryophytes and ferns, they can reproduce without a regular need for water. So remember how bryophytes and ferns, last unit we talked about how during their life cycle, particularly like towards the end of the haploid phase, they need water to get sperm cells to reach egg cells and for fertilization to occur. So they don't really, at least for some part of the year, there needs to be a regular presence of water so that can happen. Well, when it comes to seed-bearing plants, just the way that seeds work is there's no longer that need for water. Okay, so with seed plants, there is still this idea of alternation of generations. Remember, that's a common trait for all plants, and that's this whole idea of being able to flip-flop throughout the lifespan of a plant. There will be some part of their life cycle where they're a sporophyte form, and some part where they're a gametophyte form. However, when it comes to seed plants, there's no need for water to be able to bring sperm cells to egg cells. Seed-bearing plants rely on other means instead. And these other means, since there's so much variety with those other means, these plants tend to be more successful than bryophytes or ferns. Okay, so there are actually 3 adaptations that allow seed plants to reproduce without a constant need for water. So the first is this development of flowers or cones, depending on whether we're talking about angiosperms or gymnosperms. Either way, these kind of do the same thing. Also, this ability for sperm to be able to transfer for pollination by other means, not just water. And then lastly, this whole idea of the embryo or developing baby plant being able to be protected in a seed. All three of these are adaptations that are unique to seed-bearing plants like gymnosperms and angiosperms. So let's look at each of these individually. Okay, so flowers or cones have to do with the fact that unlike ferns and bryophytes, where sporophytes kind of grew out of gametophytes, cones and flowers have gametophytes actually growing inside of sporophytes. Okay, in gymnosperms, this happens in structures called cones, and these are specialized structures that that have scales that kind of store store the female gametes and provide an area where fertilization can occur. When it comes to angiosperms, similar function, but they're called flowers. We'll look at these more in detail later on in the slide, so I'm just listing them here. Okay, now when it comes to the male gametophyte with seed-bearing plants, that is pollen. Okay, so the entire male gametophyte is actually contained inside these little pollen grains, and unlike ferns and mosses where sperm has to kind of swim through water to get to the eggs, instead these pollen grains are actually carried to the female reproductive structure. And this can happen a number of ways, sometimes by wind or insects or small animals. But there we go. So sperm don't need water to fertilize eggs. This transfer happens by other means. And when you have this pollen containing these male gametophytes, when they reach the female reproductive structure and fertilization happens, we call that pollination. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to seeds, that isn't, let's take a little bit of time to look at the structure of a seed. So with ferns and bryophytes, recall that after fertilization happens, you end up with a zygote. That's where sperm cell and egg cell come together and make a fertilized egg. But then that immediately develops into a sporophyte, and then we go from there. When it comes to seed-bearing plants, however, a seed is what results after fertilization. So that zygote turns into an embryo, and a seed contains that embryo. But not only that, the seed also provides a more durable way of keeping that baby plant alive until it can eventually grow into a full-sized plant, full-size sporophyte. Okay, so a seed is actually made up of the embryo, which is that baby plant, encased with some kind of protective covering, and then there's even some sort of food supply that's provided for that baby plant until it's able to grow big enough to be able to carry out photosynthesis and support itself. Okay, so an embryo is that baby plant. It comes from the zygote that's formed after a sperm cell and egg cell come together. And then it's also the seed itself. Sometimes you'll see the term seed coat. Seed coat is just the name of that protective layer that keeps the baby plant, the embryo, from drying out and keeps the food supply nearby. Okay, so in your textbook, I think it's page 565, you'll see this diagram here, and this is actually just a little cross-section of a typical sort of seed. So here you can see the seed coat, that's the protective, waterproof kind of barrier. Then you have the embryo itself in the middle, and then you have that stored food supply that can provide for that baby embryo, until that baby plant or embryo, until it's able to photosynthesize on its own. Now, this is just another example of a seed, but you'll notice that there are sometimes modifications that can be added to seed coats to make it more successful in being able to be dispersed elsewhere. Um, if all the seeds were kind of nearby the parent plant, they all end up competing with each other. So dispersal is actually a really good way to improve upon the success of these plants. If they're able to disperse elsewhere, then they have a better chance of being able to not compete with other organisms, other plants, and survive. So some examples would be like seed coats having things like wings so that the wind can kind of carry them off. Sometimes you have seed coats that are textured, like burrs and things like that, that can, like hooks and stuff like that, that can hook onto animal coats as they pass by and get carried off. And then you can even have some seeds, if you think of like fruits, for example, some seeds have other fleshy tissues around them that can attract other animals to eat them, and then those seeds get carried off in the digestive tract. So there's a number of ways that these dispersal methods can occur. Okay, so yeah, after fertilization, the zygote turns into a plant embryo. Now, embryos don't necessarily have to grow right away into a sporophyte. That's another thing that's a benefit to seed-bearing plants. When it came to ferns and bryophytes, as soon as fertilization happens, that baby plant's got to grow and turn into a sporophyte. Well, with seed-bearing plants, that seed can a lot of times be almost like a dormant state and remain that way for quite a while until the conditions are just right for that plant to be able to grow. So it actually improves their reproductive success. And then when it grows, it's going to use that stored food supply. So as a result of this, a lot of seeds can actually survive some extreme conditions. And like I said, until the conditions are just right for that plant to be the most successful. A lot of seeds are designed to kind of only enable germination or that seed to sprout when the conditions are just right for the plant. Okay, so let's just quickly go over now the two types of groups. So we said there were gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms, there are actually 4 main groups. Now, if you want to know more about each of them, we actually have a few things that we've gone over in CK12 and in the textbook, but in the textbook, we're looking at page 567 to 568. I'm just, if you want examples, images, or things like that, they're in there, but I'm just going to list them out real quick. So there are 4 types. The first are cnidophytes, and they're in the phylum Cnidophyta. And this group of gymnosperms are kind of odd shaped. They're irregular looking, but one thing that's unique about them is that their cones are the reproductive scales where you'd find the female reproductive structures are located, are clustered in these small cones that are actually at the base of the plants. And they have a really odd shape. There aren't very many examples. There's only about 70 present-day species of them. Then you have cycads. Cycads look a little bit more like palm trees. They're really big, broad leaf kind of plants, and they have large cones in the center of them. They existed a long time ago. In the fossil record, we see them in the Triassic period. But right now, or present day, there's only about 9 different genuses of cycads. So in the big plant kingdom, that's not very many. There's only a few cycads really. But they're found in a lot of tropical and subtropical areas. Okay, ginkgos are even more rare. In fact, present day, there's only 1 species. I think that's a typo, sorry. Ginkgo biloba, there's no O there. You might want to just correct that and remove that O. Ginkgo biloba is actually the only living species that we know of. Obviously, there may have been more that occurred a long time ago. In fact, there were, the fossil record shows, but right now there's only 1. And ginkgos are actually really good at resisting, they're really tough and can do really well in polluted areas, which is why a lot of times heavily polluted cities use them for to plant, because they can do well in places that have a lot of smog and things like that. They're really they're really good at surviving in those environments. And then lastly, and the biggest group would be conifers. And whenever we talk about gymnosperms, generally speaking, we're talking about conifers. There's over 500 species, in fact. And here are some of them. They could include pines, spruces, firs, cedars, and so on. And these are, like I said, the most abundant of the 4 types of gymnosperms. Okay, so in terms of conifers, there are a couple of unique characteristics to them that make them so successful. A lot of it has to do with the fact that they can just survive better in drier conditions, and a lot of their adaptations have to do with this fact. Okay, so one is the fact that they have needles instead of broad leaves. If they have very thin thin needles for leaves, for modified leaves, that means that there's less surface area exposed. And so plants normally lose some moisture through their leaves through a process called transpiration. And when you have leaves that are very thin, that just decrease the surface area. So this is a way for conifers to actually conserve water really well. Another thing that has to do with conservation of water is the cuticle, and this is a waxy substance that coats the surface of their needles, of their leaves. And so this waxy cuticle ends up being not a completely waterproof, but a pretty good waterproofing barrier, so that again, that reduces how much transpiration can happen, how much water can leave the leaves. And lastly, a lot of conifers are evergreen. What that means is they don't lose their leaves regularly. In fact, it's rare for conifers to drop their needles. And if you think about it in terms of the amount of water that a plant would have to use to grow leaves every year would be a lot. There's a lot that goes into that. So the fact that conifers don't lose their leaves, they conserve them, means that they're able to not have to spend that water, spend that energy to keep growing leaves every year. Okay, so that's conifers. Lastly, I think this is the last slide. We're just going to go over the different angiosperms. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's not the last slide. We're going to go over angiosperms. Okay, so angiosperms have flowers. They're also known as flowering plants. That's their unique characteristic. And so flowers are of benefit because they will attract things like insects and small birds, like hummingbirds, attract those organisms to the areas where you would find pollen, where you'd find those male gametophytes. And so what that ends up doing is these insects like bees and moths and little birds like hummingbirds are able to be another way of transporting pollen to the female reproductive part. So that improves on pollination. Wind is a good method, which is what conifers and gymnosperms do, but it's not the best method. This is an even better way. Flowers also are unique in that they contain ovaries. And ovaries are reproductive structures that kind of contain the female gametophyte, or the female gametophyte, and so that ends up being an extra layer of protection for those for the egg and eventually the developing seed. Okay, after pollination happens, and we'll look more at pollination of flowers in the next unit, but after pollination, that ovary, which contains the egg that'll get fertilized, will eventually develop into a fruit. And so that provides protection for that embryo, so that it can eventually hopefully develop into an adult plant. And then also fruits will aid in dispersal. So fruits are, I mentioned it earlier, where you have some kind of fleshy tissue that surrounds the seed, and hopefully that will attract other animals or other organisms to possibly ingest that seed and carry it somewhere else. So that aids with dispersal. Okay, now angiosperms being the largest of all groups of plants it's also the most diverse. There's a lot of plants that fall into this group. So because of that, there's actually a bunch of different ways that we can organize angiosperms. So the first is organizing them according to their they're called cotyledons. So cotyledons are the first leaf or first pair of leaves that a baby plant produces when they after they germinate and sprout, like you can see here. And so monocots and dicots are just a way that we can group plants according to how many of these leaves, how many of these cotyledons they make. So that's actually what the cot means. It's just short for cotyledon. So monocots are the ones that just produce one leaf. Okay, so there's a few examples of them listed in your textbook. A couple of examples would be like corn, wheat, lilies, orchids, and palms. But if we were to look at inside of their seed, we would see that they only have one cotyledon. And then you have some that produce two leaves, like you can see here. These are called dicotyledons or dicots. And so some examples would be like roses, beans, clover, tomatoes. There's a wide variety of them. But if you were to look at their seeds, inside them, you would see that you would see these two leaves, these two cotyledons are inside. Okay, so that's one way we can group angiosperms. We can also group them according to the materials that's found in their stems. So you have some angiosperms that are considered woody plants, and that just means that if you were to look at the material that's found in their stem or that makes up their stems, they're very tough. The cells that are found there have thick walls with lots of cellulose and things like lignin, which is a substance that helps to make them stronger as well. And that just means that they can support more weight. So these end up being tougher, almost like vine-like structures. So a lot of trees, shrubs, and vines fall under this group. Okay, maybe some examples would be like grapes or vines or all the different trees. When it comes to the other group, those would be herbaceous plants. So their stems are just not as tough. They're made of, I mean, they're still cellulose, but it's not nearly as tough as some of the woodier plants. Some examples would be like dandelions or lilies or sunflowers or things like that. So their stems are much easier to cut and are just more tender and more smooth. Okay, and then the third way we can group angiosperms is by their lifespan or life cycle. So if you've ever planted a garden, you know that many flowering plants usually grow, flower, and die within a single year. But there are some plants that need more than 1 year. So we can kind of use this characteristic to divide up angiosperms. So there are some that are called annuals, and if ever you go to a gardening center, you tend to find plants grouped this way just because, you know, in terms of how long you want your plants to last. So annuals are usually they're the ones that only live for about a year. So they go through the whole grow, flower, and die within a single growing period. Okay, biennials usually take about 2 years. And so what ends up happening a lot of times is the first year they kind of germinate, they grow roots, they have a few short stems, but it's not until the second year that they often flower and produce seeds. Okay, and then after they produce seeds, they eventually die. So those are biennials. And then you have perennials, and perennials just mean that their life cycle is 2 or more years. Okay, so some examples would be like peonies, asparagus. A lot of grasses fall into perennials as well. And so they may die in the winter, you know, just because it gets cold in, you know, places where there's winter. Arizona doesn't really have that kind of cold, at least not down here. But their root systems are often strong enough where they end up sprouting again next year. Like they can continue to grow for many years. and they might even have several life cycles within the duration of their life, so they can keep producing seeds for multiple years. Okay, and I think that's it. Yep, that's it. So thanks. All right, we're done.